Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week, the real reason why nobody sounds quite like Brian May. Now, of course, the real reason that nobody sounds quite like Brian May is that none of us actually are Brian May. Come to think of it, I don't know too many guitar-playing astrophysicists, but still, it's fun to analyse someone's sound and tone, especially when that sound is as distinctive and as instantly identifiable as Brian's. And yes, as much as his touch, his musical instincts and his note choice are undoubtedly the defining factor in his sound, there are a few pieces of the puzzle which can be solved by simply understanding some of the gear that he uses, which I think it's fair to say are pretty distinctive. This is none more evidence than in the guitar solo on Bohemian Rhapsody, possibly Queen's defining track, and come to think of it, probably one of the most famous pieces of recorded music of all time. And the guitar solo in that song is a shining example of Brian's distinctive, mid-pushed, harmonically rich guitar tone, and is a great place to start if you are looking to analyse his tone, which, funnily enough, is exactly what we're going to do today. So, let's dive right in. The first in the chain, both literally and figuratively, is of course Brian's iconic Red Special, a guitar built by Brian and his father Harold at home from bits and pieces that they found lying around the house. The project started in August of 1963 and finished in October of 1964, just over a year later. Now, of course, there are 1,000,001 articles and videos dedicated to the Red Special's history, but who better to explain it than the man himself?
But this guitar evolved in the hands of me and my dad. We had no power tools, we had no experience in making guitars. We just did a few experiments and tried out various methods, and the materials we used were all things that were just lying about. So literally the oak panel which takes the strain here is from an old tabletop. The neck is from a fireplace which was 100 years old at the time, so it's about 300 years old now. You can still see the wormholes which were filled in with matchsticks, and this was all just done with spoke shaves and sandpaper and chisels. And the dot markers were from my mum's button box.
And Mum's in there too.
My mum's in there, and this is from one of my mum's large knitting needles. And the way I would fashion something like this was to get a drill and put the thing in a drill, turn the drill, and work the file here. So it's a kind of homemade hand-powered lathe.
Right.
Now, one thing Brian didn't particularly get into in that clip was the guitar's unique wiring configuration. Not as much as, at first glance, it doesn't look dissimilar, I guess, from a Stratocaster with its 3 single-coil pickups, 3 Burns trisonic pickups, worth pointing out in the Red Special's case. Brian's vision for the guitar was ultimate versatility, and to that end, each pickup not only has its own on-off switch, but a phase switch, so you can have them in or out of phase with one another. And it is that ability which, again, is a defining factor in the guitar's sound, particularly the solo in Bohemian Rhapsody, again, as Brian explains here.
These two pickups set against each other, out of phase, then the Bohemian Rhapsody sort of sound, it is like this kind of, well, instead of this, which is normal, sort of my normal setting, it'll go like this to it's got so much natural harmonics going for it.
Made me so happy there, so thank you.
And then the amp kind of brings it out, you know, the whole thing. The whole system brings out those high harmonics, so it sounds like an octave higher than it really is.
That's worth pointing out that after struggling with the commonly available 10 and 11 gauge strings at the time, Brian would ultimately settle on creating his own hybrid gauge of strings, reportedly made from banjo strings, I guess roughly comparable to an 8 or 9 gauge today. And to that end, the guitar I'm going to be using for this exercise is a Burns Red Special dating back to the early 2000s, strung with Ernie Ball Super Slinkies. 9s. That's worth pointing out that using a much lighter gauge of string than you are ordinarily used to, as with me, does immediately impact your playing. Obviously, you can't play quite as hard, and as such, it does have a marked effect on your vibrato. And as much as I'm probably a little bit heavy-handed to be doing this too frequently, it's worth saying that a lighter gauge of string, I think, in my experience at the very least, is definitely a contributory factor to Brian's sound and tone. Next in the chain, aside from Brian's fingers, is of course his famed use of a sixpence. Now, a sixpence, for those uninitiated, was an old British coin that actually was legal tender up until 1980, but technically speaking went out of fashion on Decimal Day in 1971. But to be honest, until I actually sat down to make this video, this was one of those factors that I was a little bit skeptical as to how much difference it would actually make, but suffice to say I couldn't have been more wrong. In much the same way that using a lighter gauge of string immediately impacted the sound and the way I approach the guitar, using a sixpence does immediately give you an insight and a better understanding into that laser-focused, slightly pinched, harmonically rich sound that you associate with Brian. Now, in this next clip, he's going to talk you through its versatility, primarily as a consequence of its serrated edge, but it really is intriguing to see not only how much of a difference it does make to the sound, but how very quickly it does get you straight into that Brian May ballpark.
You get a very rough sort of sound in it. I see that you're playing with a sixpenny piece, an old sixpenny piece.
Yes, I've always used these for as long as I can remember. They're very versatile because you can get a very sharp effect by using the serrations. And you get a complete contact with the string because every little touch you can feel with your fingers. And you can also use them straight, in which case they make quite a mellow sound. So the mellow sound would be like this. Whereas if you turn it sideways, it'll go...
Leaving the guitar, the first thing we have in the signal chain is of course the Treble Booster. Now, the Dallas Rangemaster Treble Booster was introduced in 1966 and was essentially a germanium-based preamp that would sit atop your amp, intended to give your sound a high-frequency clarity and, as a consequence, a noticeable gain bump. Over the years, there have been any number of incredible Treble Booster alumni, from Jimmy Page to Tony Iommi to Mark Bolan to Ritchie Blackmore. But, of course, it would be Rory Gallagher's use of a treble booster, and, funnily enough, an AC30, that would go on to inspire Brian. However, when Brian's original Dallas Rangemaster treble booster was lost in approximately mid-1973, reportedly left behind by a careless roadie at a show, of course, the Dallas Rangemaster treble booster had been out of production for a good number of years by that point, and they were pretty scarce, and as such, it was Brian's old man Harold that would yet again come to the rescue by building a clone of that original unit, although reportedly with the then much more commonly available silicon transistor as opposed to germanium transistor. And as much as we can't really conclusively say with any degree of certainty either way, it is more than likely that clone of that Dallas Rangemaster treble booster that we hear on A Night at the Opera. Now, as much as the Night at the Opera sessions were fairly scattered in their locations, Bohemian Rhapsody itself was recorded at the Quadrangle and Rockfield Studios in South Wales, a studio I know very, very well. And a cool little documentary clip I found on YouTube recently, Brian is quoted as saying that he more than likely had 3 AC30s on site for the recording session of that song. Now, of course, when you think of Brian May, you would think of a wall of AC30s. I guess outside of the Beatles, he probably is Vox's most famous proponent, but again, it's interesting to see how Brian's use of AC30s could once again be traced back to Rory Gallagher. Brian recalled that pretty much every Thursday night at one point he would go down to the Marquee Club in London to watch Rory play, and then would somehow worm his way into backstage and would pick Rory's brains, who would very obligingly show him his rig, walk him through his amp and his treble booster, which in turn sent Brian scurrying down Tottenham Court Road to a second-hand guitar shop called Take 5. As Brian recalls, I plugged in my Red Special and a Rangemaster that I found into one of these amps, and the sound was just there. It had that depth, the overtones, the sustain, and that throaty splutter. I just knew it was the sound I'd been looking for. So we bought 2 at £25 each, took them home, and that was it. And the last time I made a video focusing on Brian's guitar tone on Bohemian Rhapsody, I was literally inundated with comments alerting me to the fact that, irrespective of however close or not close I got to nailing that sound, I was ultimately missing a key piece of the puzzle, the Deacy, the little amp that could. Now, the Deacy, for those uninitiated, was a small battery-powered transistor amp built by Queen's bassist John Deacon in 1971, after he would stumble across its constituent parts strewn across a skip or a dumpster in London on his way home from band practice. John, an engineering student, would go on to mount the circuit board into a speaker cabinet with a 6.5-inch ELAC twin-cone speaker, and Brian, upon hearing his new creation, would go on to incorporate the Deacy as a fundamental part of Queen's guitar sound for at least the next 20 years, with it finding its way onto innumerable Queen tracks, notably the outro section of Bohemian Rhapsody, where you can hear its distinctive fizz and treble response. Of course, over the years, there have been any number of attempts to clone that iconic little transistor amp. I mean, relatively speaking, it was only very recently that its circuit board was finally traced to a South African transistor radio known as a Conquest Supersonic PR80. More recently, of course, in terms of clones, we have the Vox VBM1, and then more recently than that, Night Audio's Technologies Deacy kit. But as far as I've been able to tell, the Deacy wasn't actually used on the Bohemian Rhapsody solo. To quote a recent guitar player interview with Brian himself, the Bohemian Rhapsody solo was all about the Vox AC30s and Treble Booster, which was inspired by Rory Gallagher. There's very little else on my guitar. I use delays and stuff, but the fundamental tone you hear is the guitar, the Treble Booster, and the AC30. So with all of that in mind, let's see how close we can get to that Bohemian Rhapsody solo tone. Now, in terms of emulating the Vox AC30 and the Treble Booster, I'm actually going to be using Guitar Rig 7, of course a software plugin. Somewhat sacrilegious, I guess, but primarily in the absence of an original Vox AC30 from the 60s, but more largely, to be honest, to do with the fact that a few years ago, the last time I had a stab at recreating this solo tone, I felt I got relatively close. So having put a little bit more time into it this time and really tweaked it and honed it, hopefully I'm a little bit closer again. But I'm trying to keep it relatively close to Brian's original signal chain. Of course, Red Special using the neck and the middle pickup, running out of phase. Of course, Sixpence, AC30 and a Treble Booster. The last point in the signal chain then being Logic's Match EQ plugin. I had a bit of heat for using this plugin recently when I did the recreation of the Let It Be solo, but I guess my justification is that when it comes to the recording process, there are innumerable variables. The desk, the preamps, the mics, the room, any outboard gear used at the time. And using the Match EQ plugin not only goes a long way towards recreating the distinctive EQ curve of a recording, but to a degree, negating the near endless variables in the recording setup. So, without further ado, let's see how close we got. This next recording that you're going to hear is going to be my recording of the solo in isolation. Sounds a little bit like this. And now, let's hear it back to back with Brian's. This is the original recording taken from the master tapes of Bohemian Rhapsody. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed that. I know for some using software plugins is sacrilegious, but in a perfect world I would have access to an early 60s Vox AC30, but I genuinely don't know anyone who owns one, at least in the close vicinity to where I live. But I guess ultimately a piece of software is not only cheaper than a Vox AC30, but probably more reliable than a 60-something-year-old amp. As ever, I'm Chris Buck. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers guys, take care, see you soon.